So, this afternoon, now, we're going to continue. This is the third and final installment of my series about evolution versus evolution. And for those who missed the other ones and are wondering what I'm on about, it's looking at how evolution, how well it supports its own theories. The first one was mutation. I will briefly mention that later. And then the last time was hybridization, which we will recap on shortly. But the idea is not finding the missing pieces, because as we have discovered so far, a lot of the different elements or aspects, I said aspects a lot one time, that they say, oh, this is what it needs to do and this is how it should work, they also don't have any evidence that supports those claims as well. So I just need to reorganize my setup here. All right, so let's have a recap. Let's recap this. All right. So last time we looked at hybridization, and what we were talking about was it possible, or is it possible, to create more varied and interesting creatures by cross-species hybridization, which is basically getting something that's similar in structure, crossbreeding it, and having a look at something new. We used the example of the mule, which is a crossbreed between a donkey and a horse. Sorry, not crossbreeds. Anyway, go and listen to that one if you want the. But what we did find is that hybridization should lead to a new species. For example, the mule. When you breed a horse with a donkey, you get a mule. Ta-da, we made a new creature, isn't that wonderful? And then we can just keep doing that in the wonderful branches of possibility. And what it should do is that the variation should allow for niche opportunities to be exploited. So for example, the mule is a much hardier species than the donkey, and hardier than the horse and better temperament than the donkey. So they found it was really useful for doing long journeys and easy to work with, things like that. The only problem is that when you do that, only one gender is fertile. We discovered that out of the resultant offspring, it's usually only the female that is actually fertile, which doesn't work for getting more of them. And then what we found is that if you then crossbred it back with a type similar to its parent species, so a mule with a horse, you would just get a horse again. So it would just sort of revert back to what it was. We had a look at that. And what we do find is that the documented cases show that they do not live long. So you cannot establish a second generation hybrid species, and that is consistent across all platforms. I don't know what you call it, all of the different options. And so what that means is, the other aspect is that the ones that do survive, that they are so rare that there's no opportunity for them to keep going. So hybridization, as we discovered, isn't really much of an option for evolution to branch out to create new things, which, as we will look back at later in this presentation, means that you have less avenue for evolution to actually provide the idea that new creatures can occur from variations, genetic differences, and things like that. What we are going to look at today is adaptation. First, we're going to have a look at what the Bible says. So we have this scripture here. I really like this one. It's in the early passage of Romans, and it talks about, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, i.e. us, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And the rest of this passage goes on to talk about how they give the glory to something else, that they create idols, they create the ideology of nature spirits or, entities that are something other than God. And that's not what God is pleased to hear when he says, look upon my marvelous creation, who do you think did it? And they come up with some other reason because they want to not have God involved. So we're going to have a look at some of these things, but first of all, we'll have a look at how does adaptation help evolution? So as we read here, an adaptation is a feature that arose and was favoured by natural selection for its current function. Adaptations help an organism survive in its current environment. So the idea is that an animal or an organism would develop a trait that would make it more suitable to living in an environment, or to be able to move into an environment where it could become more dominant. So, for example, if you were a penguin and you just wore a t-shirt and you lived in Antarctica, you would develop a nice big furry coat or a really thick skin or whatever it is, and the rest of your generational offspring would maintain that trait. And so you would get penguins in Antarctica where they can survive in the cold. Things like that. You might have a particular animal that the idea is, according to evolution, that they will grow longer limbs or better eyesight, or they will grow wings or fins or tails or rocket launchers or whatever it is that they need to take down their prey. That's the idea, that they would develop some sort of trait that would allow them to become more dominant in a environmental niche, as we say. So what is it? Well, you might think, you just told me, but here's an example. So adaptations can come in a variety of forms. As I mentioned, it might be the changing of a creature's biology, but it can also be to do with forms of behavior. So it might be the ability to be more sensitive to their surroundings, be quicker in their reactions to get away from predators. It might be, as I mentioned, an anatomical feature that allows the organism to access a valuable resource. They talk about giraffes getting longer necks, both the same thing, to be able to reach food that is not available to shorter creatures so that they can thrive in that environment. That's the sort of thing that they're talking about. But there are different aspects to this which we'll look at a bit later. So what we can see in nature is that there is a vast variety of life forms that are across our planet that cover many ecological niches. What that means is that wherever you go, there's probably something living there. Even in the desert, even in the most desolate places on Earth, you will find some of the most incredible and unique creatures. There are frogs that basically live in the ground for years until it rains. And they live in a dormant state where they're basically considered not alive. They're almost fossilized or dehydrated. But you just add water and out it comes. There's a frog. There's animals that live in the most harshest of environments, and you think, why are you even here? And evolution would put that to their ability to adapt and grow into a environmental niche that is suited to them. But what we see here is an incredible array of species that evolution tells us that they adapted to their surroundings to become unique. Do I have an example? Of course I do. But first, before we go to this example, we need to talk about melanism. Now, you might know what that is. Does anyone know what melanism is? That's good, because I'm going to tell you, so you don't have to. Basically, melanism is a congenital excess of melanin in an organism resulting in dark pigment. What does that even mean? Melanin is our skin pigmentation. So basically, if you have an excess of that, you will have a really dark complexion. And in the extremes, you will be very black. And this actually can result in different breeds of animal. This is actually the black panther, which is a melanistic version of the jaguar, or the leopard. Jaguar, I think. I should confirm that. I think, yeah, it's the jaguar. So basically, if you go, oh, well, isn't the panther a different creature? So, well, no. It's actually a jaguar in its melanistic form. So melanism is not harmful or dangerous to the creature, and it is hereditary. So you can have, obviously it's hereditary because you have lots of black panthers out there because they breed and it's a trait that is dominant in their genes, so you get more and more black panthers. The lack of melanism is albinism. So if you're an albino, it means you have no skin pigmentation or very, very low levels of it. Here are some really cool examples. That's a wolf. That's a seal. This one's really spooky. That's a chicken. And there's some gators, some alligators. So there's some really interesting creatures out there that have a melanistic version of them. And the black panther is probably the most well-known one because we consider it a different animal, even though it's just a variation of the same thing. So the peppered moth. Let's have a look at this one. So the peppered moth is a like other animals, as we've just mentioned, it can develop melanistic variations. And its story has been used by evolutionists to say, look, it works. Here is a real-life example of evolution functioning and an animal displaying these qualities and adapting to its environment. Peppered moths are normally on the left, white with black speckles across the wings, giving it its name. And the patterning makes it well camouflaged against lichen-covered tree trunks when it rests on them during the day. So in amongst the areas of Britain and Ireland, there's these particular tree trunks, and when there's this lichen that grows on them, they can sit on there and be camouflaged, and the birds won't eat them. But the black ones are quite easily seen. So the birds will go, I'll have that, and they eat those ones. So there's a smaller population of those ones around. However, during the 19th century, people discovered machines, and they made a lot of them, and we had the Industrial Revolution. And because of that, there was a lot of pollution that began to affect the environment. So it actually killed the lichen and also made the tree trunks sooty black anyway. So that meant that the environment started to change. And what was documented is that the melanistic version started to have an advantage because the same tree that they would normally sit on was now black. And so the normal coloured moths on the right, they were easily spotted and eaten. Because moths are short-lived, this evolution by natural selection, as they say, happened quite quickly in the terms of what was observable. So, for example, the first black peppered moth was recorded in Manchester in 1848, and by 1895, 98% of peppered moths in the city were black. So it was now the pale form, the normal form, that was more obvious to predators, and the melanic form was better camouflaged and started to be more prevalent. So as a result of successive generations, the black moths came to outnumber the pale forms. So during this period of Industrial Revolution, people documented and went, wow, there's a lot more of these now. This is an example of how they have adapted to their environment. So you might think, okay, well, that's done. Let's tick the box. they're obviously on their way to becoming, well adapted to their environment, and they will grow into something different, and they'll become more powerful, and they'll take us all over, or whatever it is that evolution will do. However, in the mid-20th century, controls were introduced, and they started to reverse the effects of the pollution that had been caused. So the reduced pollution actually rolled back what had happened, and now the black moths were easy to see, and they started getting eaten again. So it basically went back to what it was before, and there was a shift. But when they look at this, they say, well, natural selection has seemed to work in both directions, always favouring the moth that is best suited to the environmental conditions. And they have observed it in many different places. So you look at that and you go, okay, well, they must be right. There's the normal version, there's the melanistic version. Pollution meant that that one was better off, and then they switched it back, and then that one was better off. So obviously, evolution is true. It's still a moth. That hasn't changed. It went one way and went back, but they're still moths. They still, just like panthers and leopards, they haven't evolved outside of their genetic setup. Now, they may shift within that genetic construct, but never outside of that. What that means is that we have something that we need to qualify. What does that actually mean? Because evolution is telling us, here is the example, isn't this wonderful, therefore it's true. However, you're talking about something within its own genetic setup is shifting slightly within its own variations, but it's still a moth. It hasn't changed anywhere. So what you're actually observing is a thing called microevolution. And there's a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution is the theory of evolution, which we've been talking about, and the ability for creatures over countless centuries or millennia to shift and change and develop into more things. Microevolution are observable variations and adaptations that occur in nature. This is real because that's just what we saw, the moths shifting and changing. And when you look at any documented cases about microevolution, people talk about the things like an animal changing its behavior. There are certain dogs or wolves that have changed the way that they interact with people so that they can better get food out of them. You see the same thing in monkeys when you go over to some of the places in Asia. They have learnt a behavior in how to get things or perhaps pickpocket people. They develop behavioral patterns that they have learned within their environment. You have also organisms building a resistance to poisons, pesticides, and toxins. Now, that is part of their genetic makeup where they have developed a resilience towards that. And now we actually see that within ourselves, within people, is that people have a higher tolerance to something than someone else. You have many variations in the size and build of people, their ability to withstand certain things. You have people that can live in extreme environments. You have people that they can't handle certain types of hot food, or they are more prevalent to a certain disease, or they are they have an ability to withstand certain conditions, and their body is able to adapt. We see that is real. But it's not evolution. It's part of the genetic construct that God has placed in all things. You might see variations in length of limbs or physical characteristics that appear in certain animals. They talk about how some of the cane toads have changed as they have more and more generations. Some of them have adapted to be skinnier and faster, but they're less hardy. And it's just so that they can get around further. But they're still toads. We're not seeing anything that's actually shifting out of its original set. And this statement here comes from, to be clear, it comes from a website that talks about creation in science. And so here they're actually saying that this particular person, he did a study on peas, and there are natural limits to genetic change. And that's what I'm focusing on. That's what I'm highlighting, is that microevolution will occur within its genetic limits. A population of organisms can vary only so much. So when someone comes and says, hey, what about this and what about that, you can come back to them and say, yeah, that's within the constraints that God set. So how do we know that? Well, basically, because of everything that we've looked at so far. So to recap on what we have that backs up what I'm saying right now is that the foundation of what makes evolution possible is not even supported by itself. We've seen that mutations are vital to evolution, yet there are many of them, mutations are random. Any that are beneficial, that actually help something, are very rare. They are not all hereditary, so even if it's good, you might not pass it on to the next generation. They take a long time to occur, and many are required over generations for something to shift into something else. And even if you get something that's good, it might not fit your ecological niche. So because there is no control, there's no purpose for mutation, it's not even a viable reason why things would actually change. And as I mentioned, hybridization, it looks like it would be possible for something to become something else, but it's actually stopped. It's genetically stopped from occurring. So whereas evolution says, hey, things will mutate, then they'll change, and then they'll become this, and they'll turn into that, and they'll, crossbreed and become all these other things, what we actually observe is that there are limits to that. Hybridization has limits. Mutation has limits. Adaptation has limits. So my statement is that microevolution demonstrates an organism's ability to thrive in its environment within the constraints of its genetic design, if that makes sense. Let's have a look at something. Look at that beautiful creature, that marvelous machine. Who knows what that is? I shouldn't even ask that question. It's a horse. Of course it's a horse. It's not a mule, it's not a donkey, it's a horse. Now, people, we like horses, we love them. They've been used for centuries because they're a very, very functional animal. Now, evolution would say it figured its way out to doing that. And you think, how? In terms of the way that survival of the fittest works, you should probably get a very dominant grey-looking blob thing that just takes over everything. But what we have is this wonderful thing. What does God say about this? He says to Job, when Job is questioning life, God says to him, "Hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible." And in my margin reference, it actually says, "The majesty of his snorting is terrifying." He poureth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goes on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage. And my margin reference says he devours the distance. Neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, "Ha ha!" And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. God has said, I made this thing. I made this because it was in place on earth and that mankind would meet it and tame it and use it. And if you have anything to do with horses, he's talking about the fact that you can take one and you cannot change its nature. You can't tell it to be afraid like a grasshopper. You can't change its ability to run for hours and hours and devour the distance. It has a lot of power. They used it in war. because you could teach it to just ignore everything else and just charge. And it's an amazing animal. And where does its genetic qualities come from? That's where the Lord says he came from. He says, I put all these things in here. Hey, did you give the horse strength? You know, why would it have evolved to be like that? Yes, to outrun predators, to eat grass, but like to run to the grass quicker than the cows? I don't know. Like you think of, why would something turn into that from something else? It doesn't make sense, and it's not even supported. We'll look at one more. The wedge-tailed eagle, or just eagles in general. Just continuing on in that same chapter, we read here, does the hawk fly by thy wisdom and stretch her wings to the south? Does the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? She dwelleth and abideth on the rock, upon the crag of the rock and the strong place. From thence she seeketh the prey, and her eyes behold afar off. We know that eagles are such a powerful bird, and they and the hawk and many others have such incredible vision that they can spot prey from the heights where they dwell. You know, they soar effortlessly. We've got other scriptures that talk about that, and they can see where they are. And God says, I made that. I set it there, and I was pleased with it. So the idea that millions of years of macroevolution just happened upon this exact configuration is, as I mentioned at the start, taking the glory away from God. His perfect design made creatures that demonstrate the wonder of his creation, and he wanted us to see them. He wanted mankind to observe them and say, how did all this thing come about? How does it fill every little pocket of the world that these amazing things exist? And God says, I want you to see that and know that I am your creator. Evolution will try and tell you there is no God. It happened this way, but they don't even have their own science to back that up. They don't even have their own proof that when you break it down, you can pick on one argument and go for hours with someone. They'll say, yeah, but this could happen and this could happen, this could happen. But you say, okay, what about this? What about that? What about all the things that are required for all of these things to keep moving? They don't happen. So for us, we look at these things, and this is the scripture I've been using the whole way through. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. We want to acknowledge the wonder of the Creator, and also think if he has the ability to balance life on this planet and set things in motion with such perfect planning, what else has he got planned for our life? And I'll just leave it there.